Hi, I like to make a lot of end grain cutting boards. So if you need a moderately complex holiday gift, I've got just the project for you. First, I want to give a shout out to MTM Wood, where I got these plans. He also has a video on this project, but you'll need to be fluent in Russian. This project allows you to use most of the tools in your shop, but you also need a good set of calipers because we'll be measuring widths of the wood in millimeters. To start, we're going to cut down some chunks of black walnut and maple into at least 40 centimeter length. Next, flatten one edge in the joiner. With this project, it's very important that your table saw blade be at a perfect 90-degree angle to the top. With your flattened edge from the joiner up against your table saw fence, cut off the rough pieces of wood, maximizing the width of the board. You can also use a bandsaw to cut down the width of the rough board. Next, flatten one face of the board back on your joiner. Now send both your walnut and maple boards through the planer to make sure you get exactly the same thickness. The first part of this project is to make two color-negative panels with different widths of wood. This part of the process involves a lot of measuring and cutting. The first step will be to rough cut each of the slats, making them slightly thicker than the final measurements. Try to maximize the pieces of each board so the pieces do not need to be cut in order. And to keep track of all this, I made a checklist that I could check off each piece as it comes out of the table saw. Notice that we double up on the 10mm pieces. More on that later. Make sure to label each piece, and it's okay to use a heavy marker. These will all come off with the planer. Now onto the maple pieces. Organize your inventory of your slats, and these are rough cuts coming out of the table saw. As a next step, you want to run them through the planer to get exact thickness. And here, consistency matters more than accuracy. So it doesn't matter if your 7mm slats are 6.9 or 7.1, as long as they're the same. When checking each slat, they should be within 1/10 of a millimeter of each other. That's an acceptable range. And remember, for what will be the widest slat, there's only two, one maple and one walnut. Inventory all your slats and then lay out both double negative panels. Use the two extra 10mm slats as the last one. In the end, they'll be cut down to 4mm. I drew a line with my square to help make sure the slats were aligned during the glue up. Each panel was 19 inches wide, but my planer was only 13.5 inch wide. So I'd have to separate them into two different panels, glue them up separately, and then run them through the planer separately. Now glue up the first half of panel A. I add a healthy amount of glue to both sides of the boards. I put some paste wax on my soft pine clamping boards to make sure they don't stick to the cutting board if there's any residual glue that gets on them. After gluing up your project for only an hour, take the clamps off and scrape off the excess glue. This will definitely help before it hardens and is harder to sand and harder to router. The glue at this point is a very elastic or rubber type consistency and very easy to scrape off. Make sure to do both sides and then re-clamp for another 24 hours. Now do the same process for the second half of panel A. Now onto the color negative, panel B. Okay, fast forward and we have all four half panels done. Now before we glue them together, we'll run them through the planer to make sure they're exactly the same thickness. The planer makes all 4 panels the same thickness. It also takes off the width dimensions of the slats, which are no longer needed at this point. We are now ready to glue up both halves of panel A and both halves of panel B. Added a few more boards and a few more clamps to make sure they didn't cup at all. Again, get the excess glue after an hour and then reclamp for 24 hours. Now back to the table saw where we'll square off the edges using our crosscut sled. Next, cut your panels into equal strips. The thickness of the strips will dictate the thickness of your cutting boards. Anywhere between 1 3/4 and 2 inches is fine. Now to keep everything in the project straight, flip up the end grade and then label. Since this next part of the process would require some finer cuts, I switched out my 50-tooth carpentry saw blade with a 90-tooth fine woodworking blade. Always remember to unplug your saw before changing a blade. And again, I made a checklist on a spreadsheet to keep track of the inventory of the zebra strips. Make sure the end grain is up when you're sending these through the table saw. There's no order to cutting these, just make sure you keep track of the ones you cut on your checklist. After all of this slicing of your strips is done, you can do a dry fit. If you alternate each of the zebra strips from panel A and panel B, the optical pattern for your cutting board should come together. You could glue these up all together, but I prefer to start with the center thicker strips and then work to the outer edges. I'll show each of the steps one more time before finishing the glue up. And don't worry about those saw blade marks. We're going to get rid of those with the router. So the next part of the project involves using a router with sled. So I'll build a router sled with you now. Use some scrap boards and some excess plywood I had laying around. The router should slide through the sled with about 1/8 of an inch on either side. To do this, you want to take the base off the router to measure it accurately. The trick to cutting any internal dimensions is to raise the saw blade up through your wood. The key to a good router sled is actually the rails. So to make them perfectly flat, I run them through the joiner and the planer. I started with some 4x4s of Douglas fir because of its straight grain. Once your rails are attached to your workbench, give everything a coat of paste wax so the sled slides nicely on your rails. Last, coat the inside of your router sled so your router slides nicely, just like a puck on ice. The router can be one of the more dangerous tools in your workshop, so make sure your project is adequately secured to your workbench before starting. Here are the 3 different types of bits we're going to use to finish our project. A straight flattening bit, a cove bit, and a roundover bit. Lower your router bit so it just takes off about 1/16 of an inch on each pass. This is end grain, so it's very hard, so it'll do multiple passes. Flip it over and now do the bottom and watch those saw marks disappear. The next step, which could save you some time, would be to bring your project to your local cabinet maker if they have a wide sander. And remember those extra 10mm strips that we talked about at the beginning of the project? Well, now we'll cut them down to make them 4mm. Okay, there's still plenty of orbital sanding to be done. I started with 120 grit and went all the way to 400. And between grits, I raised the grain by spraying some water on to make sure I got a really smooth surface. Lightly drag a pencil across to ensure you've sanded every part of the surface. Take the sharpness off the edges with a 1/8 inch roundover bit. Because this cutting board is the size of a pizza, I'll now route in some handles underneath with the cove bit. Finish with food safe oil and you'll see the color of the grain start to pop out. The last step will be to install some rubber feet on the bottom. Thanks for watching. You can use these same techniques for any optical pattern cutting board.